What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a morning talk show and gets blindsided by a host who seems more interested in stirring up controversy than having a real conversation? In just 33 seconds, George Stephanopoulos would make a comment so outrageous, so disrespectful, that Denzel Washington would do something nobody expected. He would walk off the set of Good Morning America, leaving the host speechless and the studio in complete chaos. This is the story of how a simple interview turned into one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. It started like any other Good Morning America appearance. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was ready for what they thought would be a normal conversation with Denzel Washington. He was there to talk about his latest film, a project he had poured his heart and soul into. This was supposed to be easy, a few questions about the movie, some laughs, maybe a story or two from behind the scenes. Standard stuff for someone who had done hundreds of these interviews over his legendary career. Denzel walked out onto the set with that calm confidence he always had, the kind of presence that made you pay attention without him having to demand it. He shook George's hand, sat down in the guest chair, and waited for the interview to begin. The studio audience clapped. Everything seemed fine. Everything seemed normal. But George Stephanopoulos had other plans. Instead of starting with the movie, instead of welcoming one of the greatest actors of all time with the respect he deserved, George opened with something else entirely. He leaned forward in his chair, looked directly at Denzel, and said, "So Denzel, let's talk about why you've been so quiet lately about certain social issues. Some people are saying you've lost touch, that you're not relevant anymore to the conversations that matter." The studio went quiet. You could feel the tension. Immediately. This wasn't a question, this was an accusation. And it came out of nowhere. Denzel's expression didn't change. He just looked at George for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to talk about my film, George. That's what we agreed on." But George wasn't backing down. He had that look in his eyes, that smug expression that said he thought he was being clever. He thought he was doing some kind of hard-hitting journalism. "Well, I think our audience would like to know where you stand on these issues. You have a platform. Don't you think you have a responsibility to use it?" Denzel took a breath. "I use my platform in the way I choose to use it. I'm not here to be lectured about responsibility by someone who sits in a comfortable chair and asks questions for a living." The audience gasped. This was not going the way anyone expected. George's face flushed. He clearly didn't like being challenged on his own show. "That's a bit harsh, don't you think? I'm just asking questions that people want answered." "No," Denzel said, his voice steady. "You're trying to create a moment. You're trying to make me look bad because you think it'll get you ratings. That's not journalism, George. That's just cheap." George shifted in his seat. You could see he was getting uncomfortable, but instead of backing off, he doubled down. "I think you're being defensive. Maybe there's a reason for that." "Defensive?" Denzel repeated, his tone sharpening just slightly. "I'm being direct. There's a difference. I came here to talk about a film that I'm proud of, that my cast and crew worked incredibly hard on, and you're sitting here trying to turn this into some kind of gotcha interview? That's disrespectful, not just to me, but to everyone who worked on this project." George tried to smile, tried to play it off like this was all part of the fun. "Come on, Denzel. You've been in this business long enough to know how these interviews work." "I know exactly how they work," Denzel fired back. "I also know when someone is being sincere and when someone is playing games. And right now, you're playing games." The producers were probably panicking in the control room. This was live television. There was no way to edit this out, no way to save it. George was losing control of the interview, and everyone could see it. But George wasn't done. He made the mistake of pushing even further. "I just think it's interesting that someone with your influence chooses to stay silent on things that matter to so many people. Some might call that cowardly." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Cowardly? He had just called Denzel Washington, a man who had built a career on integrity and excellence, a coward, on national television. In front of millions of people, Denzel didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared at George for a long moment, and you could see the disappointment in his eyes. Not anger, disappointment. "You know what, George? I'm done here." "Wait, what?" George said, suddenly realizing he had gone too far. "Denzel, come on. We're in the middle of an interview." "No, we're not," Denzel said, standing up from his chair. "We're in the middle of you trying to tear me down for no reason, and I don't have to sit here and take that. Nobody does." George tried to recover. I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to have an honest conversation." Denzel looked at him, and there was something almost sad in his expression. "An honest conversation requires honesty, George, and respect. You've shown neither. So, I'm leaving." The cameras were still rolling. The audience was dead silent. Nobody knew what to do. This kind of thing didn't happen on Good Morning America. Guests didn't just walk off, especially not guests like Denzel Washington. George was scrambling now. "Denzel, please, let's just take a breath and start over." But Denzel was already removing his microphone. "There's nothing to start over. You made your choice when you decided to ambush me instead of having a real conversation. That's on you." "I wasn't ambushing you," George protested, but his voice sounded weak now, defensive. "I was just asking tough questions." "Tough questions are fine," Denzel said, placing the microphone on the table. "Disrespectful questions are not. And calling someone a coward on live television isn't tough. It's just mean, and I don't have time for mean." George was floundering. "I think you're overreacting." Denzel stopped walking for just a second and turned back to look at George. "That's the problem, George. You think this is an overreaction? You don't see anything wrong with what you did, and that tells me everything I need to know." The crew didn't know whether to keep filming or cut to commercial. George was sitting there, his face red, trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. But there was no saving it. The damage was done. "I apologize if you took it the wrong way," George said. But it sounded hollow, like he was reading from a script. "I didn't take it the wrong way," Denzel replied. "I took it exactly the way you meant it. You wanted to rattle me. You wanted to get under my skin." "Well, congratulations. You did. But not in the way you hoped." George tried one more time. "Can we please just finish the interview? Let's talk about the film." Denzel shook his head. "You had your chance to talk about the film. You chose not to. That was your decision. Now I'm making mine." And with that, Denzel Washington walked off the Good Morning America set. No dramatic music, no big scene. He just left. Calm, dignified, and completely in control, the same way he had walked in. George sat there, stunned. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every awkward second. One of the producers eventually called for a commercial break, and the show cut away. But the damage was already done. What happened in those few minutes was a masterclass in standing up for yourself. Denzel Washington didn't lose his temper. He didn't shout or make a scene. He simply refused to participate in something that was designed to make him look bad. He saw what was happening, called it out, and removed himself from the situation. That takes strength. That takes confidence. That takes knowing your worth. George Stephanopoulos, on the other hand, showed something very different. He showed what happens when someone gets too comfortable in their position, when they think their platform gives them the right to treat people however they want. He thought he could push Denzel around, thought he could create a viral moment at the actor's expense, but he miscalculated badly. Because here's the thing about Denzel Washington. He's been in this industry for decades. He's seen every trick, every game, every attempt to knock him down. And he's still standing. Not because he fights dirty, but because he knows when to walk away. He knows that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the other person has already disqualified themselves. Let's talk about what actually happened in that interview. From the very first question, George wasn't interested in a conversation. He was interested in confrontation. He wanted a headline. He wanted a clip that would get shared on social media. He wanted to be the guy who challenged Denzel Washington. But he forgot one very important thing. Denzel Washington doesn't need Good Morning America. Good Morning America needs Denzel Washington. When George asked about why Denzel had been quiet on social issues, he was trying to paint him as someone who didn't care, someone who was out of touch. But that question revealed more about George than it did about Denzel. It showed that George believed the only way to be relevant was to constantly insert yourself into every controversy, every debate, every argument. He couldn't understand that someone might choose to make a difference in ways that aren't loud or public, that someone might believe actions speak louder than words. Denzel's response was perfect. He didn't take the bait. He didn't get defensive about his choices. He simply redirected the conversation to where it was supposed to be. On the film, on the work, on the thing he actually came there to discuss. That's what professionals do. They stay focused on what matters. But George couldn't let it go. He pushed and pushed, trying to force Denzel into a corner. And that's when he made his fatal mistake. He suggested that Denzel was being defensive. He tried to make it seem like Denzel was the problem, like Denzel was the one making this interview difficult, but anyone watching could see the truth. George was the one being difficult. George was the one who turned a simple promotional interview into an interrogation. When Denzel called him out on it, when he said George was trying to create a moment for ratings, you could see the truth hit home. George's face changed. He knew he'd been caught. He knew that everyone watching could see exactly what he was doing. And instead of admitting it, instead of apologizing and moving on, he got defensive. He tried to act like this was all normal, like this was just how interviews work. But it's not. At least, it shouldn't be. Good interviews are built on mutual respect. The host respects the guest's time and the reason they're there. The guest respects the host's audience and tries to give thoughtful answers. It's a partnership. But George broke that partnership the moment he decided his agenda was more important than Denzel's. And then came the word that ended everything: cowardly. George actually called Denzel Washington a coward. Think about that for a second. He called a man who has spent his entire career standing up for what he believes in, who has used his platform to mentor young actors, who has donated millions to charity, who has consistently chosen roles that challenge and inspire people, a coward. Because he doesn't tweet about every political issue. Because he doesn't perform his activism for cameras. That moment showed who George really was. It showed his arrogance, his entitlement, his belief that he had the right to judge someone he clearly didn't understand. And it backfired spectacularly. Denzel's reaction was everything it needed to be. He didn't explode. He didn't match George's energy. He simply said he was done. He removed himself from a toxic situation with grace and dignity. He showed that you don't have to engage with people who disrespect you. You don't have to justify yourself to someone who has already made up their mind about you. You can just leave. George tried to walk it back. Of course he did. He saw his interview falling apart, saw his guest walking away, and panicked. But his apology was weak. It was one of those non-apologies where you say you're sorry if someone took something the wrong way, as if the problem was Denzel's interpretation and not George's words. That kind of apology makes things worse because it shows you still don't understand what you did wrong. Denzel saw right through it. He called it out. He said George wanted to rattle him, wanted to get under his skin, and that he succeeded, just not in the way he hoped. That line was devastating because it was true. George did get a reaction, but instead of making Denzel look bad, he made himself look terrible. He exposed his own pettiness, his own need to tear someone down to build himself up. The saddest part of all of this is that it didn't have to happen. Denzel Washington is one of the most talented, most respected actors alive. He has stories that would captivate any audience. He has wisdom gained from decades in an incredibly difficult industry. He could have given an amazing interview. He wanted to give an amazing interview. He showed up, ready to talk about his work, ready to share something meaningful with the audience. But George Stephanopoulos threw all of that away because he thought he was more important than the conversation. That's the real tragedy here. The audience lost. They lost the chance to hear Denzel talk about his craft, about his process, about what drives him to keep making incredible films. They lost that because George's ego got in the way. Because George thought his gotcha questions were more valuable than genuine dialogue. When Denzel walked off that set, he wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every guest who has ever been ambushed in an interview. Every person who has ever been disrespected by someone with a microphone and a platform. Every individual who has ever been expected to just sit there and take it because speaking up might seem rude or difficult. He showed that you don't have to accept bad treatment just because someone has a title or a television show. The way he did it matters too. He was calm. He was clear. He explained exactly why he was leaving. He didn't storm off in a huff. He didn't slam doors or throw things. He just stood up, removed his microphone, and walked away. That kind of composure under pressure is rare. Most people would have yelled. Most people would have said things they'd regret later. But Denzel understood that how you leave a situation is just as important as why you leave it. George, meanwhile, was left sitting in his chair, looking like someone who just realized they made a huge mistake, because he did. He took one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, someone who is universally respected and admired, and turned him into a sympathetic figure walking away from an unfair situation. He took a moment that should have been a highlight of his show and turned it into an embarrassment. And he did it all by himself. The silence in that studio after Denzel left must have been deafening. The crew didn't know what to do. The producers were probably screaming into their headsets. The audience was sitting there in shock. and George was left to deal with the consequences of his choices. No guest to interview, no conversation to have, just empty air and the realization that he had completely blown it. This moment reveals something important about power dynamics in media. George Stephanopoulos probably thought he had all the power in that situation. He was the host. It was his show, his set, his questions. But Denzel Washington reminded everyone that guests have power too. They have the power to say no, the power to refuse to participate in something that demeans them, the power to walk away. That's a power more people should use. Too often, we let people with platforms treat us badly because we think we need them more than they need us. We think we have to play along, have to answer the unfair questions, have to smile through the disrespect. But we don't. We can do exactly what Denzel did. We can recognize when something isn't right and remove ourselves from it. That's not being difficult. That's having self-respect. George tried to frame the situation as Denzel overreacting. That's what people with power always do when they're called out. They try to make the person standing up for themselves seem unreasonable. They try to paint themselves as the victim. But nobody was buying it. Everyone watching could see what really happened. George was disrespectful. Denzel responded appropriately. End of story. What makes this even more frustrating is that George had every opportunity to make this right. When Denzel first pushed back, George could have apologized and moved on. When Denzel explained why the question was inappropriate, George could have listened and adjusted. When Denzel gave him multiple chances to course correct, George could have taken them. But he didn't. He kept pushing. He kept trying to prove he was right, and in doing so, he proved he was completely wrong. The contrast between the two men in this moment couldn't be more clear. Denzel Washington, a man who has earned every accolade and achievement through talent and hard work, remained humble and composed even as he was being disrespected. George Stephanopoulos, sitting in a position of privilege, used that position to try to tear someone down. One man showed class, the other showed arrogance. One man showed strength, the other showed weakness disguised as toughness. This is also a lesson in what real confidence looks like. Denzel didn't need to prove anything to George or to the audience. He knows who he is. He knows what he's accomplished. He knows his value. So, when someone tried to diminish him, he didn't feel the need to fight back or defend himself extensively. He just left. That's what secure people do. They don't waste energy on people who don't deserve it. George, on the other hand, showed insecurity. His need to challenge Denzel, to try to catch him off guard, to throw accusations at him, that all came from a place of insecurity. He needed to prove he was tough, prove he was a serious journalist, prove he wasn't just another morning show host. But in trying to prove all of that, he proved the opposite. He proved he wasn't ready for a real conversation with someone of Denzel's caliber. The most powerful moment came when Denzel said that George had shown neither honesty nor respect, because that's what it all comes down to. You can ask tough questions if you do it with honesty and respect. You can challenge someone's views if you approach them as an equal. You can have difficult conversations if both people are coming from a place of good faith. But George wasn't doing any of that. He was performing. He was trying to create drama, and Denzel saw right through it. When Denzel said that some battles aren't worth fighting, he was teaching a masterclass in wisdom. Not every insult deserves a response. Not every provocation deserves engagement. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away. Let the other person sit with their behavior. Let them face the consequences of their actions without giving them the satisfaction of a big confrontation. That takes more strength than fighting ever could. George wanted to fight. He wanted Denzel to lose his cool, to say something he'd regret, to give him that viral moment. But Denzel refused to give it to him. He stayed in control the entire time. Even as he was leaving, even as he was calling George out, he never lost his composure. That's the mark of someone who has true power. They don't need to yell to be heard. They don't need to make a scene to make a point. The other beautiful thing about how Denzel handled this is that he explained himself. He didn't just storm off and leave people wondering why. He told George exactly what the problem was. He told him that the questions were disrespectful. He told him that calling someone a coward on television isn't journalism. He made it crystal clear what went wrong so there could be no confusion, no spinning it later. He controlled the narrative by being direct and honest about what happened. That's another lesson worth learning. When you stand up for yourself, be clear about why. Don't leave room for people to misinterpret your actions or twist your words. Say what you mean what you say. Denzel did that perfectly. He left no doubt about why he was walking away or whose fault it was. George's attempts to keep Denzel there, to get him to stay and finish the interview, were almost painful to watch. because by that point, he had lost all credibility. Why would Denzel stay? Why would anyone stay in a situation where they're being treated poorly? George seemed to think that just asking would be enough, that his position as host gave him some kind of authority that Denzel had to respect. But respect is earned, not given. And George hadn't earned it. The fact that this happened on live television makes it even more significant. There was no editing it out, no reshooting the segment, no damage control in post-production. This was raw and real, and everyone saw it exactly as it happened. That authenticity is rare in today's media landscape. Everything is so polished and controlled. But this moment was genuine, and that's part of why it resonated with so many people. People are tired of watching guests get ambushed in interviews. They're tired of seeing hosts who care more about creating controversy than having meaningful conversations. They're tired of the gotcha journalism that prioritizes clicks over content. So when someone like Denzel Washington says enough and walks away, it feels cathartic. It feels like justice. This moment also highlights the difference between someone who has spent their career building something real versus someone who has spent their career sitting in a chair asking questions. Denzel Washington is an artist. He creates. He transforms himself into different characters. He tells stories that move people. George Stephanopoulos talks. He asks questions someone else wrote. He reads from a teleprompter. One of these requires immense skill and dedication. The other requires showing up and speaking clearly. That's not to say hosting a television show is easy. It's not. But there's a hierarchy of difficulty and achievement here that George seemed to forget. He thought he could challenge Denzel as if they were equals, but they're not equals. Denzel is operating on a completely different level. And George's inability to recognize that led to his downfall in this interview. When Denzel pointed out that George sits in a comfortable chair asking questions for a living, that was a reality check. George needed to hear that. He needed to be reminded that his position doesn't make him superior to his guests. If anything, he should be grateful that people like Denzel are willing to come on his show and share their time and stories. Instead, he treated that gift with contempt, and he paid the price for it. The irony is that George probably thought he was being brave. He probably thought that asking those hard questions made him a serious journalist. But bravery isn't about punching down. It's not about using your platform to make someone else look bad. Real bravery is admitting when you're wrong. It's apologizing sincerely when you hurt someone. It's changing course when you realize you've made a mistake. George didn't do any of those things. So his version of bravery was really just bullying with a microphone. Denzel's final words to George before leaving were perfect. He said George had his chance to talk about the film and chose not to. That this was George's decision, and now Denzel was making his. That framing put the responsibility exactly where it belonged, on George. He had control over how this interview went. He chose to make it confrontational. He chose to ignore the agreed-upon topic. He chose to insult his guest. And now he had to live with the consequences of those choices. The image of Denzel Washington walking off that set will be remembered for a long time, not because it was dramatic or explosive, but because it was dignified. He showed that you can stand up for yourself without losing yourself. You can call out bad behavior without stooping to that level. You can leave a situation with your head held high and your integrity intact. In a world that often rewards drama and dysfunction, that kind of grace is revolutionary.